Today, Newfoundland, on the eastern edge of Canada, is known for its rugged coastline, dense forests, and unforgiving climate. But long before Europeans reached these shores, the island belonged to a single people for thousands of years, the Beothuk. Archaeological evidence suggests that the ancestors of the Beothuk settled in Newfoundland around 2,000 years ago. The island was their home, and every aspect of their lives followed the rhythm of nature. In spring, they gathered along rivers to catch salmon. During the summer, they hunted cod, seals, and seabirds along the coast. As autumn arrived, they moved inland to follow migrating caribou herds, and throughout the winter they survived in shelters built deep within the forests. Their tools and weapons were crafted from stone, bone, and antler. They built lightweight canoes from birch bark and made full use of every animal they hunted, using its meat, hide, bones, and sinew. In their world, nothing was wasted. One of the Beothuk's most distinctive traditions was covering themselves with red ochre, an iron-rich mineral pigment. They applied it to their faces, bodies, clothing, weapons, and even their canoes. Historians believe it may have carried spiritual significance, served as a marker of identity, or even offered practical protection against insects. Its true purpose, however, remains uncertain. Before European contact, their population is estimated to have ranged between 1,500 and 3,000 people. They were never numerous, and the isolation of Newfoundland had allowed them to preserve their way of life for centuries. For generations, little changed. Then, toward the end of the 15th century, unfamiliar sails appeared on the horizon, bringing with them a future the Beothuk could never have imagined. In 1497, the Italian explorer John Cabot, sailing under the English flag, reached the shores of Newfoundland. It was one of the earliest documented European voyages to the island. But the true transformation came afterward. The rich cod fisheries of the North Atlantic soon attracted English, French, Basque, and Portuguese fishermen. Every summer, hundreds of ships crossed the ocean to harvest the seemingly endless supply of fish. At first, they established only seasonal camps before returning to Europe. The Beothuk watched these strangers from a distance. The earliest encounters remain poorly documented, but historical evidence suggests that the two sides occasionally exchanged goods without meeting face to face. Europeans sometimes left metal tools on the shore, and the Beothuk responded by leaving furs or other valuable items in return. Iron knives, axes, and other metal objects were unlike anything they had ever possessed. For a brief moment, peaceful coexistence seemed possible, but it did not last. By the early 17th century, Europeans were no longer arriving only to fish. Permanent settlements began to spread across the coastline. Harbors, rivers, and fishing grounds, the very places the Beothuk had depended on for generations, were gradually occupied. Their most important hunting and fishing grounds were disappearing. Forced from the coast, the Beothuk retreated deeper into the island's interior. It seemed like the safest choice. In reality, it was the first step toward catastrophe. As the Beothuk withdrew from the coast, the foundation of their way of life began to collapse. The sea had always been one of their greatest sources of food. Cod, seals, seabirds, and shellfish had sustained them for countless generations. Now, those resources were beyond their reach. Inland, they became increasingly dependent on caribou. But food was only part of the problem. European settlements gradually took control of river mouths, transportation routes, and key access points across the island. Traditional migration paths were disrupted, hunting territories shrank, and each passing year brought fewer resources. Desperation grew. At times, the Beothuk took rope, fishing nets, metal tools, or food from European camps simply to survive. To the settlers, these acts were seen as theft. Many responded with violence. Fear and mistrust quickly replaced any possibility of cooperation. The Europeans came to view the Beothuk as dangerous, while the Beothuk learned that approaching the coast could mean death. The two worlds drifted further apart until almost no contact remained. Isolation may have seemed like protection. Instead, it became a slow path toward starvation, disease, and extinction. By the beginning of the 18th century, the Beothuk population was already in visible decline, and their greatest tragedy had yet to begin. As the 18th century progressed, the Beothuk found themselves trapped between two impossible choices. Returning to the coast meant risking violent encounters with European settlers. Remaining inland meant facing hunger. But an even greater threat had already reached Newfoundland: diseases brought by Europeans. Unlike the newcomers, the Beothuk had no natural immunity to illnesses such as tuberculosis, influenza, and other infectious diseases that had spread across the Atlantic. Although the Beothuk avoided direct contact whenever possible, occasional encounters and indirect exposure were enough for disease to enter their small communities. With a population already numbering only a few thousand, every outbreak was devastating. Entire families disappeared. Elders, who carried generations of knowledge about hunting routes, seasons, and survival, died without passing on everything they knew. Children who should have become the next generation of hunters never reached adulthood. Each harsh winter became more difficult than the last. By the late 1700s, European travelers reported seeing far fewer Beothuk than before. Camps that had once been active stood abandoned. Rivers that had echoed with voices during the salmon runs had fallen silent. The Beothuk were vanishing, not through one great battle, but through decades of hunger, disease, isolation, and relentless pressure. As their numbers continued to fall, the remaining Beothuk withdrew even farther into Newfoundland's wilderness. Contact with Europeans became increasingly rare. Most Beothuk avoided settlements entirely, traveling only at night when they needed to approach former coastal territories. Their goal was no longer trade, it was survival. Occasionally, they recovered abandoned fishing gear, metal tools, or food left behind at seasonal camps. To the settlers, these actions were viewed as theft. To the Beothuk, they were acts of necessity. The cycle of fear intensified. Settlers organized armed patrols. The Beothuk fled deeper into forests and frozen valleys. Every confrontation reduced their already fragile population. By the beginning of the 19th century, many Europeans believed the Beothuk were close to extinction, yet few truly understood why. The people who had lived on Newfoundland for centuries had not disappeared because they were weak. They were being slowly pushed out of the world they had always known. Then, in the winter of 1819, one event would become the symbol of their tragedy: the capture of a young Beothuk woman named Displacement. In March 1819, a group of British settlers traveled to Red Indian Lake, hoping to recover fishing equipment they believed had been taken by the Beothuk. Instead, they found a small Beothuk camp. As the settlers approached, panic spread. Most of the Beothuk fled into the forest. One man, later identified as Nono Sabasut, stayed behind. He tried to negotiate. According to historical accounts, he attempted to persuade the settlers to release his wife. Moments later, he was shot and killed. His wife, Displacement, was captured. She had recently become a mother. Her infant son remained with the Beothuk, but without his mother, he survived only a short time. Displacement was taken to the British settlement of St. John's. There, officials hoped she could become a bridge between the Beothuk and the settlers. They treated her relatively well compared to many captives of that era, and even gave her the English name Mary March. But no kindness could erase what had happened. She had watched her husband die. She had been separated from her child, and she was now living among strangers whose language, customs, and world were completely different from her own. After several months, the British decided to return her to her people as a gesture of peace. But by then, the damage had already been done. The Beothuk's trust in the outside world had been shattered beyond repair. And for the Beothuk nation, the final chapter was drawing ever closer. By the early 1820s, the Beothuk had almost disappeared from Newfoundland. The hunting grounds that had sustained them for centuries were gone. Disease had devastated their families, and starvation had become a constant part of daily life. The few survivors avoided all contact with Europeans, believing that every encounter could be their last. Among those survivors was a young woman named Shana Dithit. She had grown up watching her world collapse. As a child, she had followed her family across rivers and forests during seasonal migrations. She learned how to hunt caribou, gather food, build shelters, and survive Newfoundland's brutal winters. But year after year, those journeys became shorter. The people became fewer. Entire family groups vanished. The places where fires once burned and children once played became silent. In the spring of 1823, Shana Dithit, her mother, and her sister were found near the Exploits River. They were no longer running from settlers. They were too weak. Months of hunger had left them exhausted. According to historical accounts, they surrendered without resistance. Her mother and sister died soon afterward, likely from tuberculosis combined with the effects of prolonged starvation. Shanna-Dithit survived. She was taken into the care of local settlers and eventually met William Cormac, a Scottish explorer determined to document everything he could about the Beothuk before it was too late. Unlike many others, Cormac did not see Shanna-Dithit simply as a curiosity. He realized she was the last living connection to an entire civilization. Although communication was difficult, Shanna-Dithit patiently shared what she remembered. She described the annual migration routes of her people. She explained how Beothuk families hunted, traveled, built camps, and buried their dead. She recalled places where violent encounters with Europeans had taken place. Most importantly, she drew maps. Simple sketches on paper identified rivers, lakes, campsites, and traditional territories that otherwise would have disappeared from history forever. Modern historians still rely on many of those drawings today. Without Shanna-Dithit, much of what we know about the Beothuk would have vanished with them. Yet while she was preserving the memory of her people, she also knew she was one of the last. By the end of the 1820s, there was little hope left. No new Beothuk communities were being found. No hunting camps appeared along the rivers. No smoke rose from the forests where they had once lived. The nation that had called Newfoundland home for nearly 2,000 years had been reduced to a single surviving woman. On June 6, 1829, Shanna-Dithit died in St. John's. She was believed to have been only about 30 years old. The official cause of death was tuberculosis, the same disease that had devastated countless indigenous communities throughout North America after European contact. With her passing, the Beothuk were officially declared extinct. It was not the end of an empire. It was not the result of one decisive battle. It was something far quieter. For centuries, a people had slowly been pushed away from their coastline. Their food sources disappeared. Disease spread through isolated communities that had no immunity. Fear replaced communication. Violence replaced trust. Little by little, generation after generation, an entire culture faded away. Their language was never fully recorded. Their songs were never preserved. Their traditions survived only in fragments remembered by the last woman who carried them. When Shanna-Dithit took her final breath, the voice of an entire nation fell silent. But the story of the Beothuk did not end there. The traces they left behind would continue waiting beneath the soil of Newfoundland, ready to tell their story to future generations. Although the Beothuk disappeared nearly 2 centuries ago, they were never completely erased. Across Newfoundland, archaeologists continue to uncover traces of their existence. Stone tools, arrowheads, cooking hearths, hunting camps, burial sites, and pieces of red ochre still emerge from the earth, offering silent evidence of a people who once called this island home. Near Red Indian Lake, where many of the final chapters of Beothuk history unfolded, stands the Beothuk Interpretation Center. Inside are artifacts, maps, and the drawings created by Shanna-Dithit, some of the only direct records left by a member of her own people. Those sketches transformed history. They revealed ancient travel routes, seasonal camps, rivers, hunting grounds, and places where tragic encounters had occurred. Without them, much of the Beothuk world would have remained a mystery. Modern research has also changed how historians understand their disappearance. The Beothuk were not destroyed by a single massacre or one catastrophic battle. Their extinction was the result of many forces acting together over generations. The loss of coastal lands, the collapse of traditional food sources, repeated conflict with settlers, introduced diseases, and the isolation that followed. Today, their story is taught not simply as the history of a vanished indigenous nation, but as a reminder of how easily an entire culture can disappear when its land, identity, and way of life are slowly taken away. The Beothuk may be gone, but their story still speaks. History often celebrates conquerors. It remembers kings, generals, and the nations that expanded across continents. Yet some of the most important stories belong to those who left behind no palaces, no monuments, and no written chronicles. The Beothuk were one of those peoples. For nearly 2,000 years, they lived in harmony with Newfoundland's rivers, forests, and rugged coastline. They survived freezing winters, they followed the caribou, they painted themselves with red ochre. They raised children, buried loved ones, and built a world that endured for generations. Then, within only a few centuries, that world disappeared. Not because they lacked courage, not because they refused to fight, but because every year their choices became fewer. Every winter grew harder, every encounter carried greater danger, until one day, there was no one left to remember their language except history itself. If you visit Newfoundland today, the forests are still there, the rivers still flow toward the sea, the wind still crosses the same cliffs the Beothuk once walked. Nature remembers, only humanity forgot. The story of the Beothuk is more than the history of one lost nation. It is a warning, a reminder that civilizations do not always vanish in a single moment. Sometimes they disappear slowly, one family, one village, one generation at a time. And perhaps the greatest tragedy is not that the Beothuk vanished, it is that so few people know they ever existed. As long as their story continues to be told, their voices will never be completely silenced.